I'm going to focus on biology for now, and we are going to look at those important points you need to prepare for your exams and the characteristics of living things. Characteristics of living things. Now, characteristics of living things, we oftentimes use the acronym Mr. Niger ACD. Mr. Niger ACD is the acronym we use. But let's move to the next characteristic of living thing, the nutrition. We said that nutrition is actually the process by which living things take in food substances, break them down, and of course absorb the nutrients and assimilate the nutrients for the purpose of one, giving us energy, two, building the system, three, helping us fight against infection. So by that, we've mentioned the three major classes of food: carbohydrate, protein, and what? Vitamins. While the carbohydrate will help give us energy, protein will help build the system, and of course, the vitamins and minerals will help to boost our immune system to actually fight against every form of infection. So that is nutrition, the process of taking in food. And when you take in the food is broken down. When the food is broken down, the nutrients are absorbed in the tissues, and of course, the cells will assimilate the nutrients as well, and it will generate energy to the system to build the system, help us to grow very well, of course, replace worn out tissues, because for us to grow, some tissues will grow older and have to be replaced by the younger ones. So how will those tissues be replaced? Is because new cells will be produced, and this is actually an aspect of the nutrient that comes to the system. That is why most times we talk about deficiency in growth. We talk about some malnutrition issues in human and other living things. That's because maybe sometimes we are not really looking at the aspect of taking in balanced diet, food in its complete ration, and all those things. Then we are faced with issues like maybe kwashiorkor, issues like maybe scurvy, and the rest of it, because of lack of some minerals, some vitamins, some classes of food that we are supposed to take in. Our system naturally can produce some of these things on its own, but cannot produce all. That is why we need to eat other food substances to assist the system produce those ones that naturally the system could not produce. And we know that if our immune system is down, if our immune system is low, we cannot possibly fight against infections around us. You agree with me that no two, three, four persons will have the same immune system. It is not possible because of so many factors: environmental factors, hygiene factors, nutrient factors, even the gene will also have a role to play in somebody's immunity. Now, sometimes you see that when a child is born, I say immunization. Take the child for immunization, vaccination, and all those things. Now, actually, all those things helps to build the system, the immune system, to boost the immune system of the living thing or the organism involved. Now, for us to have a very strong immunity, one, we need to eat balanced diet, and of course, a whole lot of fruits will be needed. And of course, if we have a very strong immune system, it is not likely that we fall ill frequently. All right, I'm talking about that because we are looking at nutrition. So that is how to define nutrition. Now, what are nutrients? Sometimes when I teach, I tell people, since we are deriving this type of energy, chemical energy, from the food we eat, so can we say generally that food is chemical? Yes, because it takes something that is chemical to give us chemical energy. So food is chemical. Anyhow you want to look at it, you say, how can soup be chemical? How can rice be chemical? We can prove to you that it's chemical because remember, too much of everything is a problem. Let's say you eat too much of rice at a time, there is always a problem that the system is going to explain to you. It's going to trigger something in the system. It even generates so much it. And don't forget that most of our own delicacy in this part of the world ends up giving us sugar and alcohol at the end of the day. Because 70 to 80% of our own food that we eat in this part of the world has to do with carbohydrates. Talk about gari, talk about food, talk about rice, yam, bread, indomie. Most of those things are carbohydrates, and they will end up giving us sugar at the end of the day. Okay, so nutrients are those substances that you take into the system to build your system and, of course, to give you energy. All right. So we look at the classes of nutrients now. So what are the classes of nutrients? We have the carbohydrates. Now, we always abbreviate this as carbs. Sometimes you come across the word carbs, it means carbohydrates. Then we have proteins. Then we have lipids. Lipids. When you're marking, you often come across a situation where students are asked to list the classes of food or the classes of nutrients we have, and they will just list, instead of lipids, you see them write fat and oil. Fat and oil. Please, fat and oil is not a class of food. Fat and oil is not a class of nutrients. Fat and oil is just an example of lipids, just as we have waxes, just as we have sphingomyelins and others. Examples that we have fat and oil as one of the example. Just like somebody will say, okay, carbohydrate is here, and we have glucose as an example of carbohydrate. So if you are asked to list the classes of food, you are not expected to list glucose. Yes, because glucose is actually an example of carbohydrate. So we are looking at classes of food. So it is not fat and oil at this point, it is lipids. So we have the lipids, and of course we have the minerals, we have the vitamins. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, water is necessary here, very necessary. And in some books, you also see the roughages. The roughages are there. Okay, so these carbohydrates you are seeing here is a very broad topic. Very broad topic that can take the whole day before we analyze carbohydrate as the case may be. But I'm just going to run down it in summary and every other class of food in summary so that we look at the remaining characteristics of living thing. I will say that carbohydrates are actually hydrates of carbon. The word hydrate means water is added. So anytime water is added to something, we understand that hydration has taken place. Dehydration is when you remove water from something. Like for instance, acid, concentrated acid pours on somebody's skin. What is going to happen? The dehydration is going to take place there because water will be absorbed, water will be removed from that surface of the skin. So dehydration has taken place because water is removed. But a process where water is just added, that is hydration. We also have hydrolysis. This one, water is added, and now the addition of water has caused a breakdown of the material. The water is added, and the addition of that water causes a breakdown of the substance. Hydrolysis has taken place. But just the addition of the water is hydration. So carbohydrate is actually hydrate of carbon. Hydrate of carbon. Meaning that you have carbon and then you add water to it. This gives you what? Carbohydrates. Okay, in simple definition. All right, so carbohydrate, we already know that carbohydrate is energy giving food. Carbohydrate helps to build the system because we have the structural carbohydrate and we have the storage carbohydrate. While the storage carbohydrate are in the system and helps to boost the immunity of the system, of course, to give us the energy, the structural carbohydrate helps to build our system. For instance, in plants, we can talk about cellulose, we can talk about hemicellulose, we can talk about lignin, those are structural carbohydrates. And then in bacteria, we can talk about peptidoglycan, those are structural carbohydrates. And then in humans, we can talk about so many other carbohydrates that helps to build our system, our structure, to help us grow. And of course, we have the storage carbohydrates such as the glycogen, such as the starch, and what have you. Those are carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrate can be classified based on number one, the number of carbon atoms. Now we have some carbohydrates that have just 3 carbon atoms. We have others that have 4 carbon atoms. We have those ones that have 5 carbon atoms, and of course the 6 carbon atoms. Those ones that have 3 carbon atoms are called the trioses. You have to take note of that. The trioses are carbohydrate with 3 carbon atoms. And then the tetroses are carbohydrate with 4 carbon atoms. The pentoses are carbohydrate with 5 carbon atoms. The hexoses are carbohydrate with 6 carbon atoms, as the case may be. We have a whole lot of examples. I'm just going to give you maybe 2 or so. We move to another thing. The trioses example, for the 3 carbon atom, we have a carbohydrate that we call glyceraldehyde. glyceraldehyde. And we also have this other one we call dihydroxyacetone. Now, these two examples of carbohydrates have 3 carbon atoms each. I will not have to bother you with the structure. The structure looks more like this. You have something like 1, 2, and of course 3. Then you have this, and you have this, and of course you have OH and H. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4 at this point. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is how glyceraldehyde will look like, just 3 carbon atoms. But you may not really bother about the structures for now because that is more advanced than this program. So we have example of those carbohydrates with 4 carbon atoms. We have erythrose, and of course we have the one we call erythrulose. And these are precursor materials that are used in the synthesis of complex materials in the system. Okay, so because they act as intermediates, because they act as intermediates, well, they are not really seen as a major product, but they are very, very important. They are very, very important in the conversion process. Most of the metabolic processes that take place in the system, the anabolic processes and the catabolic processes, makes use of most of these carbohydrates intermediately in the system. Then we have the 5 carbon atom example, we have the ribose, and we have the ribose and ribulose. This is a 5 carbon carbohydrate. Ribose, such as the substance or the compound that is seen in a respiratory chain. We talk about ribulose biphosphates, which is a bit higher than this program. So don't have to go deeply into that, but just know that this is an example of 5 carbon carbohydrate. And then we have the example of the 6 carbon carbohydrate. We have the well-known glucose that is part of it. Glucose, and of course we have fructose that is also part of it. All right. These are examples. 3 carbon carbohydrate, we have these ones. 4 carbon carbohydrate, we have these ones. 5 carbon, we have so many other examples, but for the purpose of time, we are not going to list all of them. 5 carbon, we have ribose and ribulose. 6 carbon, we have glucose, and of course, fructose. This is how to classify carbohydrate based on the number of carbon atoms. You can see that we have those ones that are longer than the rest. We can also classify carbohydrate based on the sugar units. Can also classify carbohydrate based on the sugar unit. Now, in some books, you will see saccharide units. Saccharide here means sugar. It's actually not an English word. Saccharide means sugar. So saccharide unit means sugar unit. That means what's the concentration of sugar in that particular compound. So if you are classifying these based on a saccharide unit, we have what we call the monosaccharides. We have the monosaccharides, we have the disaccharides, and of course we have the polysaccharides. So we have monosaccharides, we have disaccharides, and we have the polysaccharides. This is classification based on its sugar unit. Now, what are monosaccharides? Monosaccharides are the simple carbohydrates. Very simple carbohydrates whose structures are not very long. Example, the glucose I talked about is an example of monosaccharide. Fructose is an example of monosaccharide. All these examples I have mentioned, these are all monosaccharides. Erythrose, erythrulose, ribose, ribulose, glucose, fructose, glyceraldehyde, dihydroxyacetone. All these are examples of monosaccharide. Okay? Now, if you are looking at disaccharides are formed whenever there is a condensation of 2 monosaccharides. When 2 monosaccharides come together and with elimination of water, disaccharides are formed. So, for instance, we will have one monosaccharide. We have one monosaccharide one monosaccharide, and another monosaccharide, now giving us what we call disaccharide plus water. That's a general reaction process. One monosaccharide combining with another monosaccharide, that gives us a disaccharide, and of course with elimination of water. So actually it's a dehydration reaction and of course a condensation reaction because two monomers come together to give us a polymer. Comparing monosaccharide and disaccharide, we are seeing this as a monomer and we are seeing this as a polymer. All right. So example, if we are taking glucose as an example of a monosaccharide, so we have glucose as one monosaccharide reacting with another glucose as another monosaccharide. This is actually going to give us maltose. Therefore, maltose is an example of a disaccharide. Now, in some books, maltose will be called malt sugar. Malt sugar or grain sugar. So it's either you call maltose, malt sugar, or grain sugar. Glucose plus glucose gives you maltose. Okay, so glucose is monosaccharide, maltose is what? A disaccharide. And then we also have a possibility of glucose combining with fructose to give us sucrose. All right. So this is another example of what? Disaccharide. So this is monosaccharide. Monosaccharide gives us disaccharide. It is also possible to have glucose combining with galactose to give us lactose or milk sugar. Okay, so we have maltose, we have sucrose, and of course we have lactose as the three examples of disaccharides. Well, we have glucose, glucose, fructose, glucose, and of course galactose, giving us this. And you understand that you've seen glucose. Glucose is here, glucose is here, glucose is here, showing that glucose is very, very important as far as carbohydrate is concerned. That's the second way of classifying carbohydrates. We can also look at another pattern of classifying carbohydrate based on the functional unit. Now, based on the functional unit, we have those ones that have aldehyde group, aldehyde functional unit, aldehyde functional unit, and we have the other ones that have the ketone functional units. The aldehyde functional unit or the ketone functional unit. Those carbohydrates that have the aldehyde functional unit are called aldoses, while those ones that have the ketone functional unit are called ketoses. It is very important to know this. So we have the aldoses and then we have the ketones. That is why I said that if we have to go deeply into carbohydrate as a topic, is deeper than we know. So I'm just summarizing everything that we have in there. So we have aldoses, something that will look like this. You have this, you have this, and of course you have this. Okay? Is a functional unit we have there. And here you have these, and you have these. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now there's a difference. The difference is that for ketosis, the functional unit, if you are drawing the structure of the carbohydrate involved, the functional unit is going to be seen in between the carbon atoms. While for aldoses, the functional unit is at the tip. The very first carbon atom on the structure carries a functional unit. So that's the difference between the two. So if I have to maybe draw the structure of glucose, let me just use that to explain something. Glucose has 6 carbon atoms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. CH2OH. Now, because this is glucose and it is an aldose sugar, we have this, we have OH, we have OH, we have H, we have OH at this point. This is H, this is H, this is, because it's a mirror reflection, we have HO, then we have this, and of course we have just one hydrogen here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. You know that carbon is tetrahedral. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then every other thing is complete. Now we're looking at the functional unit. This is glucose, the open structure of glucose. Okay, we have a closed ring structure and we have the open structure. We say that the functional unit here is on the first carbon atom, that is carbon 1 of the structure. So when it appears like this is seen as what? An aldehyde sugar, because this is the aldehyde group. Is the aldehyde group that is present in a glucose structure. Now, if we are looking at the next structure, the ones that will have the ketone functional group, example, let's look at the fructose, for instance. The fructose will have something like six carbon atom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and of course 6 carbon atom. Once you have this, okay, and then you have somewhere here, then you have this OH plus OH, of course this, and then you have this, you have this, you have HO, the 1, 2, 3, 4, that's complete, and you have this, and this. Okay, so we can see the difference between glucose and fructose. The functional group at carbon 1 at the beginning of the structure for glucose, the aldehyde structure, and then we have the fructose. The functional group is not the first carbon atom, but is in the middle. So you have the double bond here attached to the oxygen atom at this point is at the middle. But whatever is the case, don't forget that you need 4 bonds as far as carbon is concerned. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 in the middle. So there is no need of bringing in hydrogen at this point. And in your organic chemistry, naming of organic structures, we would have been taught that. So these are 2 examples. We have so many other examples that we can classify carbohydrate based on the functional unit, classify carbohydrate based on the number of carbon atoms that we've explained, also classify carbohydrate based on what? The sugar unit. And of course, we've talked about monosaccharides. I've talked about disaccharide, which is a condensation of 2 monosaccharides to give us a disaccharide and with elimination of water. Now, polysaccharides are seen as a complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides. I take note of my double C. So polysaccharides are also called glycans. In some books you see glycans. Okay, these are complex carbohydrates. So we have the structural carbohydrates, and of course we have the storage carbohydrates, or the structural polysaccharides, storage polysaccharide, or structural glycans, storage glycans, as the case may be. Okay, now the word structural means that this group of carbohydrates help to build a framework, a skeleton, the backbone of a particular living thing. All right, if you are looking at humans, we talk about the skeleton of humans, we talk about the carbon content of those skeletons, we talk about other structures, the carbohydrate that builds up that. Okay, if you're looking at plants, like I already mentioned, we have other structures like the cellulose, hemicellulose, and of course lignin that helps to build the cell wall, the entire cell wall of the plant. So if you are looking at the storage polysaccharides, you are looking at those forms that carbohydrate can be converted to and stored in the system of either plant or animal for future use. Because I had maintained that when you eat food, all the things derived from that food cannot be used by the system immediately. Some will be used, some will be stored, and when they are stored, they are not stored in the raw form. They have to be converted and then stored in a form that will not be a problem to the system. A form that will stay there for a while and can still be reconverted to a useful form that the system can make use of. So we have example. I've given the examples, and in the storage, I've given the examples. Now, I like mentioning glucose and glycogen at this point. Glucose and glycogen. The two carbohydrates, the storage carbohydrates, and of course, the first end product of respiration, breakdown of carbohydrate. Now, these two are very, very important as far as humans are concerned. Now, we're looking at the world now, we are talking about diabetes here and there. And some persons don't know that we are only concentrating on too much of sugar. gives diabetes. Too much of sugar is a problem to the system. But you also have to understand that very low sugar is also a problem to the system. Very low sugar is also a problem, and it's also a type of diabetes. So if the sugar is too high in the system, it's a type of diabetes. If the sugar is too low in the system, it's also a type of diabetes. Now, if the sugar is too high, we give it a name. We call it diabetes mellitus. But if it is too low, which is also a problem to the system, we call it diabetes insipidus. But then how does the system have to balance it so that the sugar content in the blood will not be too high or will not be too low to affect the system generally? That is where these two hormones will come in. I am mentioning this because I am talking about the storage carbohydrate at this point. We have insulin, we have glucagon. These are called antagonistic hormones. Antagonistic hormones. Now, the word antagonistic means when the other is working, the other is not working. So their activities oppose each other. The activities oppose each other. This one is working, this one is resting, kind of. While this other one is working, this one is resting, kind of. Just like we have the antagonistic muscles, the bicep and the tricep. When you bend your hand, and of course the bicep contracts while the tricep relaxes. When you straighten your hand, the tricep does what? Contracts while the bicep relaxes. So the two muscles cannot be active at the same time. The bicep and the tricep cannot contract at the same time. The same thing is applicable to insulin and glucagon. Though the two of them play a role in balancing the sugar content of the blood. For instance, we eat food, carbohydrate, and then the food gives us glucose. The glucose gets directly into the bloodstream. Now, the insulin will not allow excess glucose to remain in the bloodstream. The function of the insulin is to convert this glucose that is present, the excess glucose, into glucagon, and then will store it in the liver. That is why glucagon is now seen as a storage carbohydrate, because it's actually going to be stored in the liver, okay, and is a function of the insulin. Now, I also had to analyze and see that it is not because you are eating too much sugary food, but it is because your insulin is down that people will have a residual concentration of sugar in their blood. That means the insulin cannot convert as much as it should, okay, as much as it should, the glucose into glucagon and then store it. Where the insulin has a question mark, then you have more of the glucose remaining in the bloodstream and it becomes a problem. But if the insulin is very functional, very active, as much glucose you have in the system will be converted. The excess ones will be converted into glucagon and then stored in the liver. Now, what happens if you've stayed for a while and you're hungry and you need energy, there is no food around, and there is a need for glucagon to be converted back to glucose? It is no longer the function of insulin again. So we are calling this and this antagonistic muscles, antagonistic hormones, because it is a glucagon that is actually going to convert glycogen back to glucose. And this is present in the blood, this is present in the liver. So the glucagon is in charge of converting glycogen back to glucose to elevate the concentration of glucose in the blood so that you have more energy to work with. And of course, if it is too much in the blood, the insulin will have to convert it back to the glycogen and then store on the system. So we have both the structural carbohydrate, we have the storage carbohydrate. Then the next one is the irritability.